Okay, so here's a problem. There's a big problem here. The problem is, it's true. You're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed. God only knows why. Maybe you're too short, or you're not as beautiful as you could be, or your grandparent was a serf, likely, because almost everybody's great-grandparent was. It's like, and you're not as smart as you could be, and you have a sick relative, and you have your own physical problems, and it's like, frankly, you're a mess. And you're oppressed in every possible way, including your ancestry and your biology, and the entire sum of human history has conspired to produce victimized you with all your individual pathological problems. It's like, yes, true. Okay, but the problem is that it is true. And so if you take the oppressed, you have to fractionate them. And it's like, you're a woman. Yeah, okay, well, I'm a black woman. Well, I'm a black woman who has 2 children. Well, I'm a black woman who has 2 children, and one of them isn't very healthy. And then, well, I'm a Hispanic woman, and I have a genius son who doesn't have any money so that he can't go to university. And, I had a hell of a time getting across the border. It was really hard on me to get my citizenship. My husband is an alcoholic brute. It's like, well, yeah, that sucks too. And so let's fix all your oppression. And we'll take every single thing into account, and then we'll fix yours too. We'll take every single thing into account. It's like, no, you won't, because you can't. You can't. It is technically impossible. First of all, you can't even list all the ways that you're oppressed. Second, how are you going to weight them? Third, who's going to decide? And that's the bloody thing. Who's going to decide? That's the thing. Well, what's the answer in the West? It's like, in free markets, oh yeah, Christ will never be able to solve this problem. No one can solve it. What are we going to do about that? We're going to outsource it to the marketplace. You're going to take your sorry, pathetic being, and you're going to try to offer me something that maybe I want. And I'm going to take my sorry, pathetic being, and I'm going to say, well, all things considered, as well as I can understand them, maybe I could give you this much money, which is actually a promise, for that thing. And you've packed all of your damn oppression into the price. And I've packed all my oppression into the willingness to pay it. And that solution sucks. It's a bad solution. But compared to every other solution, man, it's why 10% of us have freedom. And so there's a tremendous illogic at the bottom of this. It's like, you have to fractionate the oppressed all the way down to the level of the individual. Well, that's what the West figured out. There's a couple of figures who are at the mythological roots of our culture, and people get upset with me because I bring in religious themes, but I understand some things about mythology and religion. And it's not an accident that the axiomatic Western individual is someone who was unfairly nailed to a cross and tortured. It's like, yes, right, exactly. So what do you do about that? Well, I thought about that for a long time too. It's like, well, you don't get together in a damn mob, because all that does is allow you to be as horrible as you could possibly imagine and suffer from none of the consequences. That's a bad idea. So how about we don't do that? Well, there's a deep idea in the West too. It's like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it and try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Well, that's a truth. I read a lot about the terrible things that people have done to each other. You just cannot even imagine it. It's so awful. So you don't want to be someone like that. Now, do you have a reason to be? Yes. You have lots of reasons to be. God, there's reasons to be resentful about your existence. Everyone you know is going to die. You too. And there's going to be a fair bit of pain along the way, and lots of it's going to be unfair. It's like, yeah, no wonder you're resentful. It's like, act it out and see what happens. You make everything you're complaining about infinitely worse. There's this idea that hell is a bottomless pit, and that's because no matter how bad it is, some stupid son of a bitch like you could figure out a way to make it a lot worse. So you think, well, what do you do about that? Well, you accept it. That's what life is like. It's suffering. That's what the religious people have always said. Life is suffering. Yes. Well, who wants to admit that? Well, just think about it. Well, so what do you do in the face of that suffering? Try to reduce it. Start with yourself. What good are you? Get yourself together for Christ's sake so that when your father dies, you're not whining away in a corner and you can help plan the funeral. And you can stand up solidly so that people can rely on you. That's better. Don't be a damn victim. Of course you're a victim. Jesus. Obviously. Put yourself together. And then maybe if you put yourself together, you know how to do that. You know what's wrong with you, if you'll admit it. You know there's a few things you could polish up a little bit, that you might even be able to manage in your insufficient present condition. And so you might shine yourself up a little bit, and then your eyes will be a little more open, then you can shine yourself up a little bit more, and then maybe you could bring your family together instead of having them be the hateful, spiteful, neurotic, infighting batch that you're doomed to spend Christmas with. So then you fix yourself up a little bit, kind of humbly, because, God, you're a fixer-upper if there ever was one. And then you got to figure out, well, can you figure out how to make peace with your idiot brother? And probably not, because he's just as dumb as you, so how the hell are you going to manage that? And so then maybe you get somewhere that way, and your family's sort of functioning, and you find out, well, that kind of relieved a little bit of suffering, although it reduced the opportunities for spiteful revenge, and that's kind of a pain in the neck. And so then you get your family together a little bit, and you're a little clued in then, at least a bit, because you've done something difficult that's actually difficult. You're a little wiser, so then maybe you could put a tentative finger out beyond the family and try to change some little thing without wrecking it.
Innocent until proven guilty. Right, so you might say when those thoughts come up, because they're adversarial and accusatory thoughts, you might say, well, that is part of the realm of possibility, but I shouldn't. When your child does something wrong that's minor, you don't say you're a rotten kid. Right? You say, you bind it. You say, look, kid, here's a bunch of things you're doing right. But in this particular example, specific situation, here's the minimal thing you did incorrectly and how to alter it. And it's a really good habit of mind. It's like to address towards yourself as well as to other people, which is to say, well, what's the minimum crime that I'm responsible for in this moment? And that's part of this miracle of the presumption of innocence, and especially without proof. And a lot of what I did in my clinical practice to people who had a depressive temperament was help them make a case for themselves. It's like, well, maybe you're as bad as you think you might be, but maybe not. Let's take the contrary argument. Let's make you as innocent as you can be in this situation and only narrow the repair to the absolute minimum that needs to be manifested. Now, some people don't have that problem because they don't have a depressive state of mind, let's say. They're somewhat resilient to the cascading effects of punishment. Those are people who are low in trait neuroticism, by the way. So you could think of trait neuroticism as an index to which the degree failure co-activates punishment across a whole sequence of nested selves. The higher you are in neuroticism, the more likely a given error is to a cascade up the hierarchy of possible selves. And it's a trade-off, because sometimes when you make one little mistake, it is actually an indicator of a flaw in your character. But most of the time it isn't. And it certainly can't be responded to that all the time, because then you'd never be able to make a mistake without wiping yourself completely out. And that's obviously not helpful.
Is it fair to say that, at least in the raising of children and maybe in the raising of ourselves, that we should, as much as possible, try and emphasize that errors are due to state, not trait?
Yes, absolutely. And you do that in an argument with your wife as well. You want to make it as local and precise as you possibly can. So, and that's also one of the advantages to removing yourself from a rage or an anxiety state, because a rage or an anxiety state is low resolution and global. And so it'll be globally accusatory. And so you want to specify it and think, okay, well, what's the minimum necessary behavioral transformation to ensure that similar mistakes are not replicated in the future? And generally that doesn't require it's like if your roof leaks, you don't have to dig a new foundation. You can just fix a few shingles. And you might think, well, the rain's coming through, so you have to tear down the whole house. It's like, well, no, you have to. And you might panic and run around because the water's coming in, but it's still a bad idea to dig up the foundations every time something trivial maintenance problem needs to emerge. And so one of the things that's very useful to learn is like, well, is this only a trivial maintenance problem? And one of the advantages to that too is that if it's not the collapse of your entire self, let's say, and it's a trivial maintenance problem, you're much more able to activate that courageous response to anomaly that's part and parcel of exploratory behavior and eventual success. So, and part of the trick of many sorts of, well, I would say religious training enterprises, certainly the meditative enterprises, is something like, how do you tell yourself a story, like a real story, though, a story that actually works, that's most likely to put yourself in a position where you can confidently approach the thing that's blocking your path.
How do you overcome the suffering of life? Is be a better person. That's how you do it. Well, that's hard. It takes responsibility. And I think, if you said to someone, you want to have a meaningful life? Everything you do matters. That's the definition of a meaningful life. But everything you do matters. You're going to have to carry that with you. Or do you want to just forget about the whole meaning thing and then you don't have any responsibility because who the hell cares? And you can wander through life doing whatever you want, gratifying impulsive desires for how useful that's going to be. And you're stuck in meaninglessness, but you don't have any responsibility. Which one do you want? Well, ask yourself, which one are you pursuing? It's strange to associate something like Pinocchio with something like the biblical stories, let's say. But it's not so strange. I mean, Pinocchio is saturated, absolutely saturated, beyond belief with Christian imagery. The entire scene inside the whale is a imagistic examination of the symbolism of the fish. It's stunning. It's stunning to see. And it's not like the animators knew that that's what they were doing. You see, they're genius level animators. They're collaborating. It feels right, right? Their instinct guided them to that representation. And so and why would our instincts do that? Well, they're orienting us towards imitation. And well, what should you imitate? Well, you do imitate. You're driven to imitate by those you admire and respect. In fact, admiration and respect are the emotions that manifest themselves as part of the instinct to imitate. Well, what should you imitate? Well, you should imitate. If you're going to imitate anything, well, why not imitate the best? Well, what's the best? Well, the best is everything that calls you out to imitate it. That's what the best is. You see it and you're gripped by it because you admire someone.
Yeah.
It's like, why do you admire them? Where does that come from? Exactly.
You've talked about this instinct to orient ourselves to the ideal, right?
Yes.
Do you ever find that can be maybe too much for people, or they pathologize it somehow? Like,
oh God, yeah. Carl Jung wrote a great essay about that called "Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious," and that bloody essay saved my life. I would say. I mean, dealing with these sorts of issues for like when I wrote Maps of Meaning, it took me 15 years. I worked on it about 3 hours a day, and I worked on it all the time, every day, sick or not, holidays or not, all the time, thinking about it all the time, and it's overwhelming. It's absolutely overwhelming to grapple with such things. It's very dangerous psychologically in some sense too. It's so serious. It's down there at the bottom, and it's very, very serious. It's overwhelming. I think some of that might have been what I've had some bad health, and I think some of it is for this reason. I've seen a lot. I've seen deep into the misery of very many people, thousands of people, and so that's. I had someone phone me last night, and he just sobbed uncontrollably for 5 minutes or so. I didn't know who he was, and his grandmother had died of cancer, and his mother had died, and his fiancée had left him, and he had been suicidal, and that wasn't all that had happened to him. And he thanked me for the videos, and I've seen a lot of that. Serious business, this. So, you approach it at your peril, and with all defenses intact and carefully. But that, doesn't matter. Life's a serious business, and you have a deep intrinsic value, and if you don't bring it to the surface, the world is much lessened as a consequence of your failure. And it might be crucial what you have in you. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you, that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is, and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Therefore take no thought, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or wherewithal shall we be clothed? Those are famous lines, and that's sort of Christ the hippie, right? It's like, hey, let it all hang out. That's an old phrase. Do your thing, and everything will come to you. And these lines have been interpreted in that manner many times. But that's seriously not the proper interpretation, because there's a kicker with this injunction. And the kicker is this. For your heavenly Father knows that you have need of all these things. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. That's a lot different than the hippie thing, right? Because there's a very, very, very interesting idea here. It's certainly one of the most profound ideas that I've ever encountered. And the idea is this, is that if you configure your life so that what you are genuinely doing is aiming at the highest possible good, then the things that you need to survive and to thrive on a day-to-day basis will deliver themselves to you. That's a hypothesis, and it's not some simple hypothesis, right? Because what it basically says is, if you dare to do the most difficult thing that you can conceptualize, your life will work out better than it will if you do anything else. Well, how are you going to find out if that's true? Well, it's a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's no way you're going to find out whether or not that's true unless you do it. So no one can tell you either, because just because it works for someone else, I mean, that's interesting and all that, but it's no proof that it'll work for you. You have to be all in this game. And so the idea is, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. It's like, that's actually a fairly important caution when you're talking about not having to pay attention to what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear. It's like, what it's essentially saying is that those problems are trivial in comparison. And the probability is that if you manifest yourself properly in the world, that those things will come your way is extraordinarily high. And I believe that that's exactly right. I mean, I've watched people operate in the world, and I would say that there is no more effective way of operating in the world than to conceptualize the highest good that you can and then strive to attain it. There's no more practical pathway to the kind of success that you could have if you actually knew what success was. And so that's what this sermon is attempting to posit. It's like in the story of Pinocchio. You know, what happens at the beginning of the story of Pinocchio is that Geppetto wishes on a star. We talked about that a little bit. And so what Geppetto does is align himself with the metaphorical manifestation of the highest good he can conceptualize. And he makes a commitment, let's say. He aims at the star. And for him, the star is the possibility that he can take his creation, a puppet, right, whose strings are being pulled by unseen forces, and have it transform into something that's autonomous and real. So you organize yourself around that aim, and then what happens is The day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems, and if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim, and you can concentrate on the day, and so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can point into the distance, the far distance, and you can live in the day. And it seems to me that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning. That's how, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. Well, and then the issue is, well, back to Noah. Well, all hell's about to break loose and chaos is coming. It's like when that's happening in your life, you might want to be doing something that you regard as truly worthwhile. Because that's what will keep you afloat when everything is flooded. And you don't want to wait until the flood comes to start doing that, because if your ark's half built and you don't know how to captain it, the probability is very high that you'll drown. Part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. It's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face. The gateway to wisdom and the gateway to the development of personality, which is exactly the same thing, is precisely through the portal that you do not want to climb through. And the reason for that's actually quite technical. This is a Jungian presupposition too, is that, well, there's a bunch of things about you that are underdeveloped, and a lot of those things are because there's things you've avoided looking at because you don't want to look at them, and there's parts of you you've avoided developing because it's hard for you to develop those parts. And so it's by virtual necessity that what you need is where you don't want to look, because that's where you've kept it. So imagine this. So picture this. So you're driving somewhere in your car. Maybe you want to go visit your girlfriend. Okay, so you want to see her. So now you're in this frame, right? And the goal is the destination point and what's waiting there. And the map
obviously includes your car. So you see your car, you're inside it, you see your car, you think you see your car, but you don't. And you don't even want to. Part of what car designers do is make it unnecessary for you to see the car. See, they cover the whole car with a homogeneous shell that's like a 1 pixel image. And that's so that you don't get discomforted by the complexity of the car. And the car, the 1 pixel representation of the car, which is this shiny outer shell, is perfectly appropriate as long as the car works. Because you can reduce it to nothing. You can reduce it to an assumption. Okay, so now you're driving to see your girlfriend and a warning light goes on in the dash. Well, what's happening is the implicit complexity of the automobile has just revealed itself to you. And it's threatening the integrity of your map. And that's destabilizing your emotions. And the reason they destabilize is because you've entered a high entropy state. You were in a low entropy state where everything was certain. You could get from point A to B, and you knew exactly how to do that. You knew exactly how much energy it was going to take, and you knew how much time it was going to take. And all of a sudden, something has emerged from the chaos that underlies everything, the complex chaos that underlies everything, and it's signaling to you. And what does it signal? Well, part of what it signals is your unbelievable stupidity in relationship to your car. Because when I was your age, I could sort of understand a car, and if something went wrong with it, I could sort of maybe fix it, and probably not. But at least I could understand it. But now it's like, forget it. All that electronics, you can't even get at it. And so the light goes on, and see what happens now is the map has now become of indeterminate length. How many steps is it going to take you to get to where you were going? Well, it depends on how serious the issue is with your car. Well, that's where your mind starts to go. It's like, well, how serious is this? Should I buy a new car? Was I an idiot when I bought this car to begin with? Am I going to be able to afford this? Am I going to get taken for a ride by a malevolent mechanic because I'm ignorant? And so there's a whole problem of ethics immediately emerges as well. Because now the car doesn't work, but that means you might have to have an encounter with untrustworthy pseudo helpers. And that's also another revelation of your own insufficiency and ignorance, because maybe you're so naive that you're easily fleeced and you're just a walking target for that sort of thing. And all of that pops up. It's the Hydra, it's the Medusa, it's the snakes that are everywhere. They pops up and freezes you. That happens all the time in life, and that's part of what I was writing about in Maps of Meaning. And so then the question is, how do you deal with all those snakes? That's the permanent question. You're permanently susceptible to the radical disruption of your low entropy maps. Permanently susceptible to that. Well, you can't build a map that isn't susceptible to that. So what do? You build yourself into someone who can deal with the anomalous. And that's the hero who faces the dragon. I often don't very well, and doubt my ability to stand up for myself in discussions and aggressive situations. How do I know when I've incorporated my shadow? Practice makes perfect. One thing you could do is start keeping track of situations like that, where you walk away thinking that you should have said something. So then I would say, write down the situation and then think through and write down what you think you should have done. And then, because that's going to help you be sharper on the draw and more ready so write down the situation, write down what you think you should have done. Then sit and imagine the situation as vividly as you can, right? Get the pictures in your head and imagine yourself doing that, and try to get the psychophysiological responses up as well, so that you make it as realistic as possible. And that will actually help you practice. So Edna Foa, who's a very good clinical psychologist, has demonstrated quite clearly that when treating post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, if you get people to sit and imagine being back in the stressful situation, they have to do that voluntarily and after at least 18 months after the trauma.
and she did psychophysiological recording of heart rate and skin conductance and that kind of thing. She showed that the people who showed the highest levels of stress reactivity to the reimagining were the ones who got better fastest and stayed better longest. So you have a situation that you know you haven't mastered. Define the situation repeatedly. Find your proper action repeatedly. Practice implementing that in your imagination, and then start to do that in your real life. And that'll see, if you write down what you should have said, you'll find out what you really want and what you really think. And that'll be your shadow talking. That's the best way to think about it, is that the part of your brain that wishes it would have done something different is the shadow associated with the aggression whose integration would strengthen your character. When Nietzsche announced the death of God, he formulated another proposition. He said that we may have to become gods merely to atone for the sin of deicide. And so he believed that the overman, the superman, would be someone who, through the power of his own will, set his own values. Now, I spent a lot of time reading Carl Jung, in relationship to Nietzsche. Jung, for example, published must be a 1,500-page, 2-volume book on the first third of Thus Spake Zarathustra, and was a very deep Nietzschean scholar, but fell under the influence of Freud. And this turned out to be of cardinal significance, because Freud was one of the first secular thinkers to note that in some unbelievably fundamental sense, we are not masters in our own house. There are sub-personalities within us. There are complexes within us. There are angels and demons within us. That's another way of thinking about it. And they pull us this way and that, sometimes independent of our will and often contrary to our will. So Freud's conclusion was, it's very difficult for human beings to create their own values because we have an intrinsic nature that's not subject to our arbitrary will. And then Jung took that a step further, and he said, well, there's no doubt that we act out a myth and a story, and that in the deepest sense, that has to be a theological story, and that the spirit that guides us has to have a unitary nature, which he did associate with Christ quite explicitly. And it's a vicious rejoinder to the Nietzschean presumption that we can create and impose our own values. For the psychoanalysts, those values, and I would say for the wise clinicians, those values have to be discovered, not self-generated and imposed. Plus, you just don't live long enough to do that. You're just not wise enough to generate a whole system of universally applicable values out of whole cloth in the span of your trivial life.
And if you know you're doing that, then you reduce life to a game. You have created the meaning of life. Well, who is the creator? You? What gives you the right to do that? What gives you the power to do that? You did not create the universe. How can you write the laws of morality any more than you can write the laws of physics?
Well, it's also, people find that shallow. You know, in my clinical work, I saw this time and time again. So if I was dealing with someone who was suffering, you know, maybe they had a tragedy in their own life, a medical tragedy or medical tragedy among members of their family, or maybe they had been subject to some really vicious, malevolent actors and they were despairing, they had to discover the values that would lift them out of that catastrophe. They couldn't impose them. And it's a real search. I think this is probably related to your work on prayer. It's a real search. And one of the things I used to counsel my clients about, and I also built a program called Self-Authoring that helps people do this, and this is associated with that biblical injunction in the New Testament to knock and have the door open and to ask and to receive and to seek and to find, is that you can have a dialogue, an interior dialogue that precedes something like this. And I think it's a prayer, which is, okay, I understand
because I'm reasonably mature, that there is a tragic and malevolent element to life, and it's deep enough to destabilize me and to upset my faith in existence itself. Is there a path that I could walk down that would be so rich and meaningful that I would find the challenge of dealing with the tragedy and malevolence ennobling and worthwhile? And then it's a search. You think, well, what would be of sufficient value to offer that possibility? And people find that they find it in love, they find it in family, they find it in friendship, they find it in sacrificial occupation, let's say, they find it in beauty. But these aren't created values, they're discovered values. And then you bring yourself into alignment with them. As Nietzsche pointed out, I suppose, is that there's some real utility in staring into an abyss. And Nietzsche warned, right, if you stare into an abyss, the abyss might stare into you, and that if you fight with monsters, you risk becoming a monster. And that's an extremely wise caution. But one of the things I've sort of sorted out in relationship to the crucifixion image is that the crucifixion image and the passion story, in some real sense, and I'm speaking psychologically here, not religiously, at least to begin with, is the ultimate abyss, because it brings together all the elements of unfair suffering that might characterize life, or that do characterize life. It brings them together in a single story. And then it makes the claim that if you gaze upon that image with sufficient intensity and duration, and perhaps faith, which you have to have in order to gaze upon it at all, is that what you end up seeing and contemplating is not death and hell, but the resurrection and the overcoming of death and hell. And you know, one of the things clinicians have learned in the last 100 years, perhaps above all else, maybe they learned two things, is that honest dialogue promotes health and redeems. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is, if you face what disturbs you and forces you into paralysis and avoidance and tyranny, if you face that forthrightly and voluntarily, that will ennoble your character and help you grow. So a lot of what a clinician does is take a fear that someone might have that's paralyzing them, and then break it down into small subsets, sort of like the brick in relationship to the cathedral, and then have people practice voluntary confrontation. And what inevitably happens is not that people get less afraid, but that they become braver and more competent. So then you might say, if you tied that back into this idea of the evil that besets creation and the notion of human free will, you might say that the universe is constituted such that it's a greater good that evil can exist as a possibility, and that it's a greater good that human beings have free will than that they're compelled slaves. And the downside of that is that we can freely choose evil. And then that accounts for the pervasive evil that characterizes human endeavor and the cosmos in some sense. But that a world without that possibility, because it would involve pure subjugation and no choice and no voluntary assent and no real destiny, a world without that would be a much lesser place. Because one of the things you can say is that it's possible that God left human beings something important to do. I would say, in some sense, by definition, is that the most profound goods are reflected in the structure of the human heart. If people are striving forward, and I mean forward rather than downward, let's say, forward and uphill, they are by definition pursuing something that's a reflection of a transcendent good. It's transcendent because if they already had it, which means it would be imminent, if they already had it, they wouldn't have to pursue it. They posit something outside of themselves as better. And then the ultimate definition of that, in some sense, is the pursuit of the divinely good. And again, I see that as a matter of definition.